Pastor Mark Driscoll became one of the most recognizable, controversial, and influential evangelical leaders in the United States during the early 2000s. As the founder of Mars Hill Church in Seattle, Driscoll cultivated a reputation for being bold, uncompromising, and willing to challenge modern culture with a forceful, masculine brand of Christianity that resonated with tens of thousands of followers. At the peak of his success, Mars Hill Church grew into a multi-campus megachurch with over 15,000 weekly attendees, millions of sermon downloads, national conferences, and widespread influence across evangelical culture. But beneath the surface of rapid expansion, best-selling books, and charismatic preaching, a pattern of bullying, spiritual abuse, financial misconduct, and authoritarian leadership was slowly pulling the ministry apart. Driscoll's story began in the mid-1990s, when he launched Mars Hill with only a handful of members. His raw, direct preaching style instantly set him apart. He spoke candidly about sexuality, culture, sin, and male responsibility at a time when many pastors were adopting softer, more approachable tones. Younger audiences embraced his message. He felt real, unfiltered, and fearless. Rapid growth followed. Driscoll positioned himself as a leader of the new Calvinist movement, becoming a founding member of the Gospel Coalition and regularly appearing at evangelical conferences and events. By the early 2000s, Mars Hill had become one of the fastest-growing churches in the nation. Driscoll's sermons were downloaded millions of times per year. His message that men should take control of their families, households, and spiritual lives resonated, even as critics argued that his rhetoric frequently veered into misogyny, authoritarianism, and emotional intimidation. But behind the explosive growth, internal concerns were mounting. Staff members described Driscoll as intimidating, volatile, and vindictive. Former elders and pastors said he created a culture where disagreement was viewed as rebellion, and loyalty to Driscoll personally was more important than commitment to the congregation. Several longtime leaders resigned, citing emotional abuse, threats, or being forced out for raising concerns. These internal fractures remained hidden from the public for years, until former staff members began speaking out. One of the earliest major controversies emerged in 2007, when former elders accused Driscoll of creating a toxic leadership culture. Church members were disciplined or shunned for questioning decisions, and staff recalled meetings described as verbal beat. Concerns were raised to outside evangelical organizations, but Driscoll's rising popularity often overshadowed his critics. Then came a series of scandals that ultimately led to Driscoll's downfall. In 2012, reports surfaced that Mars Hill had paid a marketing firm over $200,000 to artificially boost Driscoll's book, Real Marriage, onto the New York Times bestseller list, a scheme that allowed him to promote himself as a best-selling author while using church funds to do it. Critics called the tactic unethical, deceptive, and a misuse of donor contributions. Shortly after, former members published accounts of coercive church discipline processes, where individuals who attempted to leave the church were publicly humiliated, pressured into confessions, or ostracized. Dozens of staff and volunteers also came forward describing emotional abuse, harsh treatment, and a culture of fear. Some members reported that they felt more like employees of a corporation than congregants in a faith community. In 2014, the situation escalated dramatically when a group of former elders formally accused Driscoll of bullying, intimidation, and creating a fear-driven environment. They provided documentation of harsh leadership methods, including confidential recordings, emails, and testimonies from staff. The church launched an internal investigation, and the findings were damning. The report concluded that Driscoll had indeed abused his power, shown anger issues, and repeatedly humiliated staff and leaders. As the investigation continued, Driscoll went on leave, and Mars Hill Church began to collapse. Over the next several months, attendance plummeted, major campuses closed, and financial instability grew. Supporters who had once viewed him as a heroic, uncompromising pastor now saw a leader whose unchecked authority had fractured one of the largest and most influential churches in the country. In October 2014, Driscoll resigned from Mars Hill. Within weeks, the entire church organization announced that it would dissolve, closing all campuses and distributing assets to local successors. What followed was a remarkable fall. Driscoll had gone from one of the most downloaded preachers in America to a controversial figure whose leadership had become synonymous with spiritual abuse, toxic church culture, and the dangers of authoritarian leadership within religious institutions. Many former members reported long-lasting trauma, describing years of therapy needed to recover from the emotional manipulation and fear-based environment. Staff members reported burnout, depression, and shattered trust in spiritual authority. Financially, the collapse cost millions. Mars Hill had collected enormous sums in donations, tithes, and special offerings, but the organization's aggressive expansion left it unstable, and the scandal accelerated its downfall. The misuse of church funds for marketing. Driscoll's books also became a symbol of the blurred line between ministry and personal ambition. In the years after his resignation, Driscoll relocated to Arizona and launched a new church, the Trinity Church, attempting a comeback. But new controversies followed him there too. Former members of the new congregation reported similar behavior patterns, including intimidation, nepotism, and coercive control. Some families claimed they were pressured to cut ties with relatives deemed spiritually threatening. Staff eventually resigned, citing the same complaints that had ended Mars Hill. Pastor Mark Driscoll's story remains one of the most significant leadership failures in modern American Christianity. It highlights how charisma, media presence, and rapid growth can mask deeper issues within a church's leadership structure. It also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated authority, the seduction of fame, and the ease with which spiritual power can be abused. Driscoll never faced prison time, but he did face widespread condemnation, investigation, and the total collapse of the ministry he built from the ground up. For many followers, the emotional and spiritual fallout was equivalent to betrayal. They lost not just a pastor, but a community, friendships, marriages, and in some cases, their faith. The downfall of Mars Hill sparked nationwide discussions about church governance, accountability, elder oversight, and mental health protection for numerous books, documentaries, and podcasts have since examined the case, including The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, which brought together testimonies from staff, victims, experts, and observers. Ultimately, Driscoll's journey from celebrated preacher to disgraced leader illustrates a painful truth. A ministry built on fear, control, and unchecked charisma may grow fast, but it cannot last. And when it collapses, the damage spreads far beyond the pulpit, into homes, families, hearts, and communities that once believed they were safe within its walls. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the heart of Dallas, Texas, during the 1980s and 1990s, Robert Tilton rose to prominence as one of the most visible televangelists in America. Known for his energetic sermons and booming voice, Tilton preached a gospel centered on prosperity, divine favor, and miraculous healing. Millions watched him on television, believing that giving generously to his ministry would bring God's blessings into their own lives. What few knew was that Tilton had built an empire not on faith alone, but on manipulation, deception, and financial exploitation. Tilton's ministry, Word of Faith, worldwide, commanded a massive following. People from across the country sent in donations, often in the form of cash or checks, with the hope that their seed money would bring divine returns. Tilton's sermons were carefully constructed performances. He would instruct viewers to mail money to him with promises that God would multiply their gifts, often showcasing envelopes containing donations on television to demonstrate faith in action. Congregants and viewers alike believed that Tilton served as a conduit for God's blessings. Behind the cameras, however, the operation was far less spiritual. Investigative reports revealed that a significant portion of donations were diverted for personal enrichment, extravagant travel, luxury cars, and an opulent lifestyle that starkly contrasted the humble image portrayed on television. Church auditors later discovered that tens of millions of dollars had flowed through the ministry with little oversight, and that donations intended for the needy were rarely used as promised. The scandal began to unravel in the early 1990s. A series of investigative reports by ABC's Primetime Live highlighted inconsistencies in Tilton's financial practices. Producers secretly recorded interactions that suggested donors' gifts were being collected under false pretenses. Witnesses, including former employees and volunteers, testified that Tilton emphasized wealth accumulation for himself, while simultaneously asking for ever larger contributions from followers. Some victims reported donating life savings or going into debt because of the pressure to give in faith. Further investigation revealed a complex web of financial deception, Tilton's organization operated multiple non-profit entities, some registered as charitable organizations, others as private trusts. Money was moved between accounts to obscure its ultimate use, and donors were often kept in the dark about where their contributions went. Staff members who raised concerns were threatened, dismissed, or pressured to remain silent. Meanwhile, Tilton continued broadcasting nationally, expanding his reach and reinforcing the narrative that generosity toward the ministry would bring divine favor. Legal action followed. In 1991, the Texas Attorney General's office launched an investigation into the ministry's financial practices. Tilton claimed that all funds were used to advance the gospel, and that accusations of fraud were misunderstandings. However, documents and testimonies painted a different picture, one in which personal enrichment and ostentatious spending were prioritized over the spiritual and material needs of followers. Under scrutiny, Tilton's empire began to crumble. Federal investigations examined whether the solicitation of funds constituted fraud, and the television network ABC aired a damning expose showing letters from desperate donors who had been misled. Some had sent money in hopes of healing for terminal illnesses. Others had been promised prosperity that never materialized. The public outcry was intense, tarnishing Tilton's reputation and shaking the trust of millions of viewers. Despite the controversy, Tilton remained resilient. He restructured his ministry, moving operations overseas and continuing to solicit donations via international broadcasts. Lawsuits and settlements followed, and in 1998, Tilton agreed to a financial settlement that required transparency and accountability for future donations. Although the scandal ended his dominance as a televangelist, it highlighted the dark potential for religious leaders to exploit faith for personal gain. The aftermath left a lasting impression on both congregants and the broader public. Many followers struggled with the emotional and financial consequences of their donations, some losing entire life savings. Scholars and critics examined Tilton's methods as a case study in televangelist fraud, noting the careful manipulation of media, charisma, and religious authority to extract money from trusting individuals. The story remains a stark warning about the dangers of conflating spiritual leadership with personal profit. For those who once believed in Tilton's promises, the haunting question lingers: when faith becomes currency, how much of belief is genuine, and how much is a price paid for deception? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In Atlanta, Georgia, Pastor Eddie Long rose to prominence in the 1980s and 1990s as the charismatic leader of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, one of the largest congregations in the United States. With a booming voice, dynamic sermons, and a seemingly magnetic personality, Long attracted tens of thousands of followers, both locally and nationally. He preached messages of prosperity, success, and divine favor, emphasizing that faithfulness to God and to the church would result in personal blessings, financial stability, and spiritual growth. For congregants, Long appeared to be a living embodiment of divine favor. He drove expensive vehicles, owned multiple properties, and traveled extensively, all while presenting himself as a humble servant of God. The church grew exponentially under his leadership, with Sunday services often drawing more than 25,000 attendees, alongside a vast television ministry that broadcast his sermons nationwide. To the outside observer, Long was a model of success, a pastor who had seemingly harnessed faith into tangible prosperity for himself and his congregation. Yet behind the towering pulpit and the polished public image, disturbing allegations began to surface. In 2010, 4 young men, all former members of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, filed lawsuits against Long, accusing him of sexual misconduct that spanned years. They alleged that he had used his spiritual authority and pastoral influence to manipulate, coerce, and sexually exploit them while they were minors and young adults. The lawsuits claimed that Long would select promising young men from the congregation, mentor them, and then isolate them in private sessions under the guise of counseling or spiritual guidance. The accusations shocked the community. Long had long cultivated an image of moral authority and mentorship, particularly for young men in the church. Parents trusted him implicitly, often sending their sons to meet with him privately to receive guidance. Many of the alleged victims described being groomed over months, with Long using scripture, spiritual promises, and his position of power to normalize inappropriate behavior. In several cases, He allegedly told his victims that compliance was a sign of devotion to God, and that refusal would result in spiritual failure. Simultaneously, Long's financial dealings raised eyebrows. Reports suggested that he had amassed considerable wealth through donations, book sales, speaking engagements, and church-sponsored enterprises. Investigators noted that church members were encouraged to give generously, often under the belief that their contributions were directly tied to blessings and divine favor. Funds were funneled into personal accounts, luxury purchases, and the maintenance of an opulent lifestyle, blurring the line between pastoral stewardship and personal enrichment. The lawsuits prompted a media firestorm. News outlets covered the story extensively, interviewing former congregants, legal experts, and church members. The juxtaposition of Long as a public persona, a revered pastor, motivational speaker, and spiritual guide, with the allegations of sexual abuse and financial exploitation, created widespread shock and disbelief. Many longtime members struggled to reconcile their admiration for Long with the emerging evidence of misconduct. Legal proceedings moved quickly, with settlement negotiations and court filings dominating headlines. In 2011, Long reached confidential settlements with the 4 accusers. While the terms were sealed, the case cast a permanent shadow over his ministry, forcing the church and its leadership to address issues of accountability, oversight, and the misuse of spiritual authority. The settlement did not include an admission of guilt, but it left the public and congregants with lingering questions about his conduct and motivations. The fallout extended beyond the courtroom. New Birth Missionary Baptist Church faced internal divisions, with some members leaving in protest, others grappling with disillusionment, and a portion remaining loyal, convinced of Long's innocence or divine favor. Public scrutiny increased, prompting other churches to examine safeguarding policies, particularly concerning youth mentorship, financial transparency, and pastoral boundaries. Eddie Long continued his ministry for several years after the settlements, maintaining a presence in Atlanta and appearing at conferences and speaking engagements. He remained a figure of both reverence and controversy, emblematic of the complex dynamics that arise when faith, charisma, and unchecked authority intersect. Long's death in 2017 closed a chapter on a life marked by both extraordinary influence and deeply troubling allegations. For many, the story of Eddie Long serves as a cautionary tale. The very qualities that can inspire devotion, charisma, authority, and spiritual guidance can also be manipulated to exploit the faithful, raising difficult questions about trust, power, and the true cost of belief. When a pastor's sermons preach prosperity and righteousness, how do you discern the difference between divine guidance and personal greed? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the sun-soaked neighborhoods of Los Angeles, California, during the 1980s, a man named Peter Popoff captivated the hearts and wallets of thousands with a promise as old as religion itself: miracles delivered through faith. Popoff, a self-proclaimed faith healer, preached on television and in megachurch auditoriums across the United States, claiming that God had endowed him with the ability to cure disease, restore fortunes, and heal the sick through divine intervention. Crowds were drawn to his energetic performances, captivated by his charisma, and convinced by the spectacular testimonies of those who claimed to have been healed. What the public did not see was a carefully orchestrated empire built not on divine power, but on deception, manipulation, and relentless financial exploitation. Popoff's rise to prominence began in the 1970s. The son of a Lutheran minister, he leveraged his upbringing in the church to develop a deep understanding of religious language and symbolism. By the time he reached adulthood, he had perfected the art of persuasion, mastering emotional appeals that could sway entire congregations. He appeared on television with a polished presence, engaging directly with viewers and presenting himself as an unassailable conduit for God's miracles. His claim was simple yet powerful: if one had faith and sent money, God would reward that faith with blessings, whether in health, wealth, or personal happiness. At the center of Popoff's ministry was the business of miracles. Followers were encouraged to send seed offerings, donations purportedly meant to catalyze divine favor. Popoff would read these letters on live television, occasionally mentioning donors' names, medical conditions, or personal struggles. The audience was left with the impression that he possessed extraordinary spiritual insight. In reality, Popoff was receiving information about these individuals through secret means. his wife, Elizabeth, collected prayer request forms and communicated details to him via an earpiece during live broadcasts. This system allowed him to appear omniscient, astonishing viewers with his knowledge of intimate personal details. The financial structure of the ministry was equally elaborate. Donations came not only from television viewers but also from live events, merchandise, and mail-order programs. Reports indicate that Popoff's annual income reached into the tens of millions of dollars during the peak of his early career. Expensive cars, lavish homes, and luxurious vacations became the outward signs of his success, presented to the public as evidence of divine favor. Congregants were led to believe that their contributions were directly linked to miracles, reinforcing a cycle of giving that enriched Popoff personally while fostering dependency among followers. Popoff's methods attracted attention from skeptics and investigative journalists. In 1986, the James Randi Educational Foundation, led by famed skeptic James Randi, began scrutinizing Popoff's performances. Using hidden cameras and detailed analysis, Randi demonstrated that Popoff was receiving information from his wife through a concealed earpiece, a revelation that exploded into national headlines. The exposé was damning, revealing a sophisticated system of deceit that preyed on faith and desperation. Despite this, Popoff initially denied the allegations, claiming that skeptics were jealous of his divine gifts. The fallout from the expose was swift. Donations plummeted, and public trust in Popoff's ministry was severely damaged. Television networks dropped his programs, and many of his former followers expressed feelings of betrayal, anger, and shame. Yet Popoff was undeterred. By the mid-1990s, he had reinvented himself, launching a new television ministry that capitalized on his remaining audience and the notoriety from his prior exposure. With improved production techniques, polished broadcasts, and a focus on prosperity theology, Popoff gradually rebuilt his empire. Financially, the revival was substantial. Popoff continued soliciting donations, often under the guise of helping impoverished communities or funding missionary work. Legal documents later revealed that significant portions of these funds were diverted to personal expenses, including luxury vehicles, real estate acquisitions, and lavish travel. Followers were encouraged to sow seeds with the promise of divine returns, creating an ongoing stream of income directly tied to faith and belief. Many congregants, motivated by desperation, illness, or hope, gave far beyond their means, often emptying savings or taking loans to fulfill Popoff's requests. Popoff's revival did not go unnoticed by regulatory authorities. In 1987, he faced the Federal Trade Commission (FTC) investigation for mail fraud related to solicitation of funds. The FTC charged him with misrepresenting the use of donations and deceiving donors regarding miraculous healing. Popoff agreed to a settlement, surrendering a portion of his assets and ceasing operations for a period, though he continued to maintain a public presence. Despite legal scrutiny, he leveraged his notoriety to regain followers, using media coverage to portray himself as a persecuted man of God, attacked by skeptics and secular authorities. The human cost of Popoff's ministry extended beyond financial exploitation. Individuals suffering from serious medical conditions were encouraged to rely on faith and donations rather than seeking medical treatment, sometimes resulting in preventable harm. Families sacrificed resources in pursuit of divine intervention, often impoverishing themselves in the process. Emotional and spiritual manipulation created long-lasting psychological scars, with followers internalizing guilt and shame for perceived lack of faith when promised miracles failed to materialize. By the 2000s, Popoff had re-established himself as a prominent televangelist. His programming reached millions weekly, and donations again flowed steadily. Yet, the core structure of his ministry remained unchanged, a combination of persuasive charisma, media manipulation, and financial exploitation disguised as spiritual guidance. Former members and critics documented the cycle of deception, noting that while the public narrative emphasized healing and divine favor, the internal reality was one of profit-driven operations designed to enrich Popoff at the expense of vulnerable believers. Despite multiple investigations and public exposure, Popoff maintained influence over a significant number of followers. Testimonials from current adherents praised his teachings, interpreted as a message of hope and divine provision. While former members recounted feelings of betrayal and disillusionment, legal challenges continued intermittently, focusing on accounting practices, misrepresentation, and solicitation fraud. Nevertheless, Popoff's ability to rebuild his ministry highlights the resilience of charisma, the enduring appeal of promises of miracles, and the complexity of separating faith from exploitation. The story of Peter Popoff exemplifies the perils of uncritical trust in religious authority. It reveals how charisma, media savvy, and the language of faith can be leveraged to create immense personal wealth, often at the expense of followers, financial stability, and emotional well-being. Congregants who donated their life savings in search of divine intervention became entangled in a system that prioritized profit over compassion, and the line between spiritual leadership and financial exploitation was blurred beyond recognition. For those who watched Popoff on television, attended his rallies, or sent money hoping for healing, the haunting question remains: when miracles come with a price tag, who truly benefits the believer, or the man claiming to channel divine power? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the rural outskirts of Arkansas, Pastor Tony Alamo established a ministry that combined charismatic preaching with aggressive financial solicitation. Born in 1934 as Bernie Lazar Hoffman, Alamo reinvented himself as a religious leader who claimed divine authority, eventually founding the Tony Alamo Christian Ministries. His ministry, which grew throughout the 1970s and 1980s, attracted thousands of followers who believed that giving generously to Alamo's church would secure spiritual blessings, protection, and prosperity. To outsiders, he appeared to be a devoted man of God, a dynamic preacher with a compelling vision. However, the reality behind the ministry was far darker, intertwining financial exploitation, abuse, and manipulation. Alamo's rise to prominence was fueled by a combination of media savvy, persuasive charisma, and a promise of salvation for those willing to give their loyalty and their money. Sermons emphasized obedience to the pastor as obedience to God, creating an environment in which questioning authority was equated with spiritual failure. Congregants were encouraged to donate beyond their means, often giving savings, property, or other personal assets in pursuit of divine favor. These funds were rarely used for charitable purposes. Instead, they financed Alamo's personal luxuries, including multiple residences, vehicles, and extravagant travel. By the late 1970s, Alamo had consolidated his financial empire. He operated businesses that were ostensibly connected to his ministry, from publishing operations to music studios, yet profits were directed primarily to his personal accounts. He maintained tight control over all church finances, insisting on secrecy and framing inquiries as challenges to faith. Staff members were often coerced into complicity, with any dissent framed as disloyalty to God and the congregation. Families were pressured to submit financially, sometimes sacrificing essential needs for the sake of the ministry. The psychological control exerted by Alamo extended beyond finances. He preached an extreme interpretation of Christianity, often emphasizing the consequences of sin and the importance of total obedience. Children were raised within this rigid structure, and young adults were instructed that serving the pastor was their highest calling. Reports from former members revealed that Alamo exercised authority over nearly every aspect of congregants' lives, including personal relationships, housing, and employment. Those who resisted faced ostracism, shaming, or expulsion. Alamo's methods were not limited to spiritual and financial control. Allegations of sexual abuse emerged over the years. Investigations uncovered that he had engaged in sexual misconduct with underage female members, exploiting his authority to manipulate and intimidate victims. Survivors recounted being pressured into compliance with threats of divine punishment or community rejection. Many described a culture in which faith and fear were inseparable, leaving victims isolated and afraid to report abuse. Legal authorities began investigating Alamo in the 1980s and 1990s, but he often evaded accountability through relocation, legal maneuvering, and exploiting the complexities of interstate jurisdiction. He established properties in Arkansas, California, and other states, sometimes operating under different organizational names to obscure ownership and financial activity. Despite repeated scrutiny, he continued to solicit donations and maintain his public persona as a devoted, righteous pastor. The tipping point came in the late 1990s, when multiple former members, supported by investigative journalism, began exposing Alamo's financial and sexual misconduct. Authorities documented extensive financial irregularities, including the use of church donations to fund personal luxury items, real estate acquisitions, and a lavish lifestyle incompatible with the modest means of his congregants. Complaints from victims of sexual abuse prompted coordinated investigations across multiple states, culminating in arrests and formal charges. In 2008, Alamo was finally arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual abuse of minors. Court documents revealed decades of abuse, manipulation, and financial exploitation. Witnesses testified about the systemic control Alamo maintained over his congregation, describing how obedience was enforced through fear, guilt, and promises of divine favor. Victims recounted the emotional and spiritual trauma inflicted upon them, highlighting the devastating impact of combining charismatic authority with unchecked power. The trial captured national attention. Prosecutors presented a comprehensive account of Alamo's criminal activities, emphasizing the intertwining of financial exploitation and sexual abuse. Evidence included financial records, testimony from former congregants, and corroborating accounts from victims who had suffered abuse as children. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had monetized faith, weaponized obedience, and preyed upon vulnerability for personal gain. Despite his attempts to maintain public support, Alamo was convicted on multiple counts, including sexual abuse and tax evasion related to the church's finances. He received a lengthy prison sentence, effectively ending his ability to continue his ministry or exploit followers. The legal outcome provided some measure of justice for victims, though the emotional and financial damage inflicted upon thousands of congregants persisted. The aftermath of Alamo's empire left communities shattered. Families struggled to rebuild their lives after years of manipulation, abuse, and financial loss. Survivors worked to reclaim autonomy, often seeking therapy and support networks to address both psychological and spiritual trauma. The church properties were seized or closed, and public trust in religious organizations experienced a broader reckoning. Scholars and commentators analyzed the case as a stark example of how religious authority can be exploited to achieve personal gain, highlighting the need for oversight, accountability, and education within faith communities. Alamo's story also illustrates a broader pattern: the dangerous intersection of charisma, authority, and unchecked power. By exploiting belief and devotion, he was able to accumulate wealth, manipulate followers, and commit crimes under the guise of spiritual guidance. The survivors' experiences serve as a chilling reminder of the vulnerability inherent in blind faith and the consequences when religious devotion is leveraged for personal enrichment. For those who once revered Tony Alamo as a shepherd of their souls, the haunting question remains: when faith is exploited and belief commodified, who ultimately pays the price, the deceiver or those who dared to trust? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the heartland of Missouri, Pastor Jim Bakker rose to fame in the 1970s and 1980s as the charismatic host of the PTL Club, a televangelist program that reached millions across the United States. Bakker presented himself as a man of faith, a devoted servant of God, and a purveyor of divine blessings. With a booming voice, theatrical presentations, and carefully crafted media appearances, he attracted a massive following, promising spiritual guidance, prosperity, and miracles to those who believed. At the center of Bakker's empire was the construction of Heritage USA, a sprawling Christian theme park and resort in Fort Mill, South Carolina, designed to provide both spiritual enrichment and entertainment. Visitors could attend worship services, watch televised broadcasts, participate in Christian-themed amusement activities, and even stay in on-site hotels. The complex became a symbol of Bakker's ambition, reflecting both his charisma and his desire to blend faith with financial enterprise. The operation required vast amounts of funding, and Bakker relied heavily on donations from viewers of his television program. These contributions were framed as acts of faith, a seed planted in hope of spiritual and material returns. Bakker's messaging encouraged congregants to give generously, often presenting testimonials of miraculous healings or divine favor in exchange for gifts. The psychological appeal was profound. Believers were told that giving not only strengthened the ministry but also brought blessings into their own lives. Behind the scenes, however, the financial management of the PTL organization was deeply flawed and, in many cases, fraudulent. Investigators later uncovered evidence that donations were misused, diverted into personal accounts, and applied toward lavish lifestyles rather than ministry or charitable work. Bakker himself enjoyed luxury vehicles, expensive properties, and other indulgences, creating a stark contrast between the public perception of a humble man of God and the private reality of wealth accumulation. The collapse of Bakker's empire began to unfold in the mid-1980s. Reports emerged alleging financial mismanagement, sexual misconduct, and deceptive solicitation practices. The allegations gained traction after a series of investigative journalism pieces detailed inconsistencies between the promises made to donors and the actual allocation of funds. Former employees and insiders described a culture of fear, manipulation, and unquestioned loyalty, in which questioning leadership was met with threats of spiritual condemnation or dismissal. Legal scrutiny intensified as the Federal Securities Commission and other authorities examined Bakker's operations. Investigations revealed that investors and donors were often misled about the financial health of Heritage USA and the PTL organization. Revenue streams from donations, sponsorships, and merchandise were sometimes misrepresented, and funds were channeled toward personal enrichment rather than the charitable and spiritual objectives advertised to followers. The scandal erupted publicly in 1987 when evidence of both financial fraud and sexual misconduct came to light. Bakker faced multiple charges, including mail and wire fraud, conspiracy, and falsifying financial statements. The prosecution presented documentation showing that millions of dollars had been diverted improperly, along with testimony from employees, investors, and congregants who had been misled or coerced. Witnesses described how Bakker's public persona as a benevolent spiritual leader masked a calculated exploitation of trust, influence, and religious authority. The trial captivated the nation. Viewers who had once tuned in to the PTL Club felt betrayed, struggling to reconcile the image of a preacher devoted to God with the reality of criminal behavior. Bakker's defense attempted to frame the issues as mismanagement rather than intentional fraud, arguing that errors had been made in the operation of a large and complex ministry. However, the consistency of witness testimony, financial records, and documentary evidence painted a clear picture of deliberate deception. In 1989, Jim Bakker was convicted on multiple counts, receiving a 45-year prison sentence and a substantial fine, although his sentence was later reduced. The conviction permanently damaged his reputation and dismantled the PTL organization as it had existed. Heritage USA eventually declared bankruptcy, and the theme park, hotels, and facilities were sold or repurposed. Congregants and investors were left to grapple with financial losses and the emotional toll of betrayal by a trusted religious leader. The aftermath of the Bakker scandal had far-reaching consequences for televangelism and faith-based enterprises. Regulatory agencies increased scrutiny of religious fundraising, requiring greater transparency, accountability, and oversight. Former followers and employees faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives, addressing both financial and psychological trauma caused by years of manipulation and misplaced trust. Scholars and religious commentators analyzed the case as a cautionary tale of how charisma, media influence, and spiritual authority can be exploited for personal gain. Despite his imprisonment and public disgrace, Bakker eventually returned to television in the 1990s, continuing to preach and broadcast his messages, though on a much smaller scale. His ability to regain a following underscored the enduring appeal of faith leaders, even after scandals of extraordinary magnitude. For many, the legacy of Bakker's ministry remains a complex mix of spiritual inspiration, betrayal, and financial ruin. The story of Jim Bakker serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerability inherent in placing unchecked trust in charismatic leaders. It illustrates how faith, when intertwined with media influence and financial ambition, can become a tool for exploitation rather than empowerment. When devotion is monetized and miracles are sold, who ultimately pays the heaviest price? The preacher or the believers who gave everything they had in faith? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the 1980s and 1990s, John Avanzini, a Texas-based televangelist, became a prominent figure in the world of prosperity gospel preaching. Operating primarily out of Fort Worth, Texas, Avanzini captivated audiences with his promises of financial blessings, health, and divine favor in exchange for faith-filled giving. Unlike traditional ministers who focused on scripture and moral guidance, Avanzini's sermons centered on the notion that God rewarded monetary generosity with tangible wealth. 2 followers. His teachings appeared revolutionary, a practical application of biblical principles that offered both spiritual enlightenment and financial success. Avanzini's rise was fueled by his dynamic television presence. Through syndicated programming, he reached millions of viewers across the United States, often showcasing letters and testimonies from individuals claiming miraculous financial or health-related benefits after sending donations. He framed giving as a spiritual obligation, emphasizing that prosperity was a divine promise contingent upon obedience and faithfulness. His charismatic delivery, coupled with the allure of tangible results, created a devoted audience willing to donate substantial sums of money, often beyond their personal means. Behind the camera, however, the situation was less sacred than it appeared. Avanzini managed his operations with an eye toward expanding influence and wealth. Donations collected from viewers, including life savings, credit card contributions, and mortgage payments, were funneled into organizational accounts with little transparency. Funds were redirected for personal enrichment, including luxury travel, expensive real estate, and high-end vehicles. In addition, the television operation itself was financed in part by the very donations Avanzini solicited, creating a self-perpetuating cycle in which faith translated directly into revenue for the ministry. Employees and volunteers who questioned Avanzini's methods often faced intense pressure to remain silent. Longtime staff described a culture in which loyalty was enforced through spiritual and social pressure. Challenging, Avanzini was equated with disobedience to God. Congregants were encouraged to view the preacher's material wealth as evidence of divine favor, further solidifying his authority and minimizing skepticism. Families were persuaded to give assets, sometimes putting themselves into debt, under the belief that their sacrifice would yield miraculous returns. Financial scrutiny of Avanzini's ministry began in earnest in the late 1980s, as investigative journalists and former donors highlighted inconsistencies between promises made and results delivered. A series of exposes revealed that many of the miraculous testimonies were either unverifiable or exaggerated. Donations intended for charitable outreach were frequently redirected toward operational costs or Avanzini's personal benefit. Despite mounting evidence, Avanzini maintained his public persona, presenting himself as a misunderstood spiritual leader, persecuted by secular authorities and skeptical media. A turning point came when federal and state authorities began investigating the ministry's financial practices. Allegations included misrepresentation of charitable intent, failure to properly report income, and misuse of donor funds. Investigators examined corporate filings, bank accounts, and donation records, uncovering a pattern of diversion that benefited Avanzini directly. Many of the transactions were structured through non-profit entities and trusts, creating a veneer of legitimacy while masking the true allocation of funds. Former donors reported feeling manipulated, often coerced into giving by appeals to fear, guilt, and the promise of divine favor. Public hearings and media coverage further exposed the methods employed by Avanzini. Investigative reports highlighted the emotional manipulation inherent in his sermons, emphasizing psychological tactics designed to encourage giving. Followers recounted experiences of personal letters read on television, miracle stories presented as proof of divine power, and pressure to participate in large-scale fundraising events. Critics argued that these tactics exploited the vulnerable, particularly those facing financial or medical hardship, creating a climate of dependence on the ministry and its leader. Legal action followed, with lawsuits filed by former congregants and donors seeking restitution. Court documents detailed the extent of financial misrepresentation, including records of donations redirected from charitable purposes to personal enrichment. Witness testimony underscored the systematic nature of the exploitation, highlighting how Avanzini combined charisma, theological justification, and media influence to maintain control over followers and their resources. While the cases varied in outcome, the pattern of financial abuse and manipulation was consistent, painting a clear picture of intentional exploitation under the guise of spiritual guidance. The broader implications of Avanzini's operations extended beyond individual donors. His prominence in the prosperity gospel movement contributed to a cultural shift in religious fundraising, normalizing the notion that faith could be monetized and that spiritual favor was contingent upon financial contribution. Other televangelists adopted similar models, emphasizing the link between giving and receiving blessings, creating a network of ministries that relied heavily on persuasive fundraising and the personal charisma of their leaders. Avanzini's ministry, despite legal scrutiny and public controversy, continued to operate, albeit on a smaller scale. He maintained a presence through television broadcasts, seminars, and publications, drawing followers who either remained loyal or were new converts unaware of past controversies. Former members and critics continued to speak out, sharing accounts of financial and psychological manipulation. While the ministry adapted to maintain both revenue streams and influence, the human cost of Avanzini's empire was substantial. Families reported financial hardship after contributing significant portions of their income, some losing homes or incurring debt. Emotional and spiritual distress was common among those who realized they had been exploited, with many grappling with feelings of betrayal, guilt, and disillusionment. Survivors recounted long-lasting impacts, including strained family relationships and diminished trust in religious institutions. The story of John Avanzini serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of faith, media, and financial exploitation. It demonstrates how religious authority, when combined with charisma and persuasive communication, can be leveraged to extract wealth from followers while maintaining the illusion of divine legitimacy. For many, the experience highlights the importance of critical discernment, transparency, and accountability within faith-based organizations. Ultimately, the haunting question posed by Avanzini's ministry is one that resonates across generations of followers and observers. When trust in spiritual guidance is converted into financial gain, who has enriched the faithful believer, or the pastor who profits from their devotion? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the quiet suburbs of Chicago, Illinois, Pastor Scott L. Lee emerged in the early 1990s as the leader of Miracle Temple, a growing megachurch that promised spiritual renewal, healing, and prosperity. Lee cultivated an image of devout piety, humility, and divine insight, attracting thousands of congregants from across the Midwest. His sermons were filled with promises that God would reward faith, obedience, and generosity, encouraging members to donate liberally to the ministry. What appeared to outsiders as a thriving faith community was, in reality, a meticulously orchestrated system designed to channel wealth into Lee's personal coffers. From the outset, Lee demonstrated a keen understanding of media, marketing, and psychological persuasion. Miracle Temple broadcasts reached tens of thousands via local television and radio, featuring testimonials of miraculous healings, financial windfalls, and personal transformations. These stories, often emotionally charged and dramatized, served to reinforce the belief that generous giving would yield divine favor. Congregants were taught that their contributions were not merely charitable donations, but acts of faith that would invoke blessings in their own lives. Lee's financial operations were extensive and opaque. Donations were funneled through multiple church accounts, non-profit entities, and affiliated businesses, creating a labyrinthine structure that obscured the ultimate use of funds. Investigations later revealed that a significant portion of the money went directly to Lee's personal expenses, including luxury homes, vehicles, and international travel. Church staff were pressured to maintain strict confidentiality regarding financial matters, and any questions about allocations were framed as challenges to God's authority. The control Lee exercised over congregants extended beyond money. He exerted influence over personal decisions, relationships, and employment, often positioning himself as the arbiter of spiritual guidance. Members reported being instructed on whom to marry, how to raise children, and even which jobs to pursue, all framed as directives from God, mediated through the pastor. This pervasive control created an environment in which obedience was equated with righteousness, and dissent was met with shaming, ostracism, or spiritual condemnation. By the late 1990s, reports of irregularities began to surface. Former members and employees described a ministry driven more by personal enrichment than spiritual mission. Some congregants recounted giving tens of thousands of dollars in donations under the belief that it would secure miraculous outcomes, only to see little evidence of promised blessings. Investigative journalists documented lavish expenditures by Lee, contrasting them with the economic struggles of his congregants, many of whom had depleted savings or incurred debt to support the ministry. legal authorities became involved after complaints regarding financial fraud, misrepresentation, and embezzlement surfaced. Regulators and prosecutors scrutinized the flow of donations, the operation of affiliated businesses, and the promises made to followers. Bank records revealed extensive transfers to personal accounts, purchases inconsistent with the stated mission of Miracle Temple, and misleading representations regarding charitable use of funds. Former staff provided testimony detailing pressure to solicit funds aggressively, fabricate miracle stories, and conceal financial realities from the public. The scandal escalated as federal investigations uncovered evidence of systematic exploitation. Lee had leveraged his position to cultivate unquestioning loyalty, using both charisma and fear to maintain compliance among the intricate financial network he established allowed him to sustain a lavish lifestyle while minimizing transparency. Legal filings and court documents illustrated a pattern of behavior in which donations were manipulated to enrich the pastor personally, often at the expense of the faithful. The trial captured national attention, highlighting the vulnerabilities inherent in faith-based communities when spiritual authority is unchecked. Witnesses recounted how the promise of miracles and divine favor was used as leverage to extract substantial financial contributions. The prosecution emphasized that Lee's actions constituted a deliberate and sustained effort to defraud followers, exploiting their devotion for personal gain. Families spoke of the emotional, financial, and spiritual toll exacted by the ministry's operations, underscoring the depth of the harm inflicted. Ultimately, Lee was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, misrepresentation, and embezzlement. He received a lengthy prison sentence, and the assets of Miracle Temple were seized to provide restitution to victims. The congregation, once a thriving community, was left fractured and demoralized, struggling to reconcile faith with the betrayal of trust they had experienced. Many former members sought counseling, support groups, and spiritual guidance outside the influence of the ministry, attempting to rebuild lives disrupted by deception. The case of Scott L. Lee exemplifies the dangers of combining charisma, religious authority, and financial manipulation. It demonstrates how the promise of divine reward can be weaponized to exploit trust, extract wealth, and consolidate power. Survivors described a long-lasting impact, both financially and emotionally, with some reporting difficulties in forming relationships or trusting other religious institutions. The broader public, too, was left grappling with questions about oversight, accountability, and the potential for abuse within faith-based organizations. For those who once believed in the miraculous promises of Miracle Temple, the haunting question remains: when devotion is commodified and faith is used as currency, who ultimately benefits, the followers who give all they have, or the pastor who profits from their belief? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In Phoenix, Arizona, Pastor Craig Von Bissig emerged in the 1990s as the charismatic leader of Faithful Fellowship, a rapidly expanding church known for its energetic sermons, vibrant music ministry, and promises of divine blessings. Von Bissig portrayed himself as a humble servant of God, yet his sermons emphasized prosperity, success, and the rewards of faithful giving. Followers were encouraged to donate generously, with assurances that their contributions would bring spiritual and material returns. The church grew exponentially, drawing thousands of congregants from across Arizona and neighboring states, many of whom became deeply invested in both the ministry and Von Bissig's personal teachings. Von Bissig's rise to prominence was closely tied to his media presence. He hosted televised sermons, participated in radio broadcasts, and produced motivational recordings, all designed to expand the reach of Faithful Fellowship. Each program carefully highlighted testimonies from followers who claimed miraculous healing, financial windfalls, or personal transformation after giving to the ministry. These stories were presented as evidence of God's favor, reinforcing the link between financial contributions and divine reward. The psychological impact on viewers was profound. Believers were motivated to give beyond their means, often sacrificing essential resources for the hope of spiritual or material gain. Behind the public facade, Von Bissig managed a complex financial operation that prioritized personal enrichment over ministry work. Donations flowed into church accounts, often without oversight or accountability. Investigations later revealed that funds were diverted to support Von Bissig's luxurious lifestyle, which included expensive real estate, high-end vehicles, and international travel. Staff members who questioned the allocation of resources were silenced, pressured to conform, or dismissed. Congregants were rarely informed of how their contributions were used, with the pastor framing inquiries as challenges to faith or spiritual loyalty. The control von Bissig exercised over his congregation extended beyond finances. Members described intense pressure to comply with the pastor's directives, both publicly and privately. Obedience was equated with spiritual righteousness, and dissent was framed as moral or spiritual failure. Families reported that von Bissig influenced decisions regarding education, employment, and marriage, creating an environment in which personal autonomy was subordinated to the authority of the pastor. The culture of the church fostered dependency, with followers internalizing guilt, shame, and fear as mechanisms to maintain compliance. By the early 2000s, reports of misconduct began to emerge. Former congregants and whistleblowers revealed that von Bissig's ministry had systematically misused donations, misrepresented charitable intent, and exploited followers psychologically. Letters, financial statements, and internal documents showed that contributions intended for ministry expansion or outreach were often redirected to personal accounts or luxury expenditures. Victims reported feeling manipulated and deceived, with some experiencing financial ruin after giving life savings to the church. Legal investigations followed, focusing on both financial mismanagement and potential fraud. Regulatory authorities examined the flow of donations, the operation of affiliated entities, and the claims made to followers regarding miraculous outcomes. Testimonies highlighted a pattern of intentional deception. Von Bissig had cultivated a trusting and obedient following while systematically diverting resources to fund his personal lifestyle. Former staff corroborated these accounts, describing a culture of secrecy, intimidation, and relentless pressure to solicit funds. The scandal gained national attention as investigative journalists documented the extent of von Bissig's exploitation. Media reports juxtaposed his public persona as a humble, faith-driven pastor with the reality of opulent personal spending, misleading fundraising, and coercion. Stories from victims illustrated the depth of emotional and financial harm, detailing the long-term consequences of faith-based manipulation. Families were left struggling to recover, both materially and psychologically, after years of devotion that had been leveraged for personal gain. In court, evidence demonstrated a deliberate pattern of financial exploitation. Von Bissig was charged with fraud, misrepresentation, and embezzlement. Financial records, witness testimony, and former congregants' statements painted a picture of systematic abuse, with donations serving as the primary mechanism for personal enrichment. Prosecutors emphasized that von Bissig's operations were carefully constructed to maintain an illusion of spiritual authority while diverting wealth for personal benefit. Convicted on multiple counts, von Bissig faced significant prison time and restitution requirements. Faithful Fellowship was dismantled, its properties seized or sold, and its congregation fractured. Many former members sought counseling, support groups, and spiritual guidance outside the influence of the church, attempting to rebuild their lives after the emotional and financial trauma inflicted by the pastor's manipulation. The case of Craig von Bissig highlights the dangers of combining charisma, religious authority, and financial ambition. It demonstrates how the promise of divine favor can be leveraged to exploit trust, extract wealth, and consolidate control over followers. Survivors recounted long-lasting impacts, including financial loss, broken relationships, and diminished trust in religious institutions. Scholars and religious commentators analyzed the ministry as a cautionary tale, emphasizing the need for transparency, oversight, and critical discernment within faith communities. For those who once believed in the promises of faithful fellowship, the haunting question remains: when spiritual devotion becomes currency, who truly benefits the followers who give everything in faith, or the pastor who profits from their belief? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In Dallas, Texas during the 1990s and 2000s, Marcus Lamb became a prominent figure in the world of Christian broadcasting. As the co-founder of Daystar Television Network, Lamb presented himself as a devout, humble servant of God, using his media platform to preach prosperity, deliver spiritual guidance, and broadcast religious programming to millions across the United States and abroad. While many viewed him as a source of inspiration, Investigative reports and insider accounts later revealed a more troubling picture: a ministry structured to consolidate power, influence, and financial gain under the guise of faith. Lamb's rise was fueled by an intricate understanding of television media, marketing, and persuasive communication. Daystar's broadcasts combined traditional preaching with modern production techniques, featuring testimonials of divine healings, financial blessings, and miraculous interventions. Congregants and viewers were encouraged to donate generously, with the promise that contributions would invoke God's favor in their own lives. These appeals were highly effective, creating a vast network of supporters motivated by faith, hope, and sometimes desperation. Behind the scenes, Lamb exercised extensive control over the network's operations, finances, and messaging. Donations flowed through multiple entities connected to Daystar, and internal accounting revealed that significant funds were allocated to lavish personal and business expenses. Properties, private jets, luxury vehicles, and international travel became part of the public image of success, framed as evidence of God's blessings. Church staff and network employees were expected to maintain strict confidentiality, and challenges to financial or operational decisions were framed as attacks on faith or spiritual authority. The financial manipulation extended beyond simple diversion of funds. Lamb's ministry used sophisticated messaging to encourage recurring donations, often emphasizing urgency, divine promises, and the moral obligation of faithful giving. Followers were led to believe that withholding financial support could result in personal or spiritual misfortune. Families sometimes depleted savings, incurred debt, or sacrificed essential needs to contribute, motivated by the belief that their generosity would result in miraculous outcomes. Investigative journalists and former employees began documenting patterns of mismanagement, financial opacity, and coercion. Accounts described a culture in which questioning authority was equated with sinfulness, and where obedience to Lamb was framed as a moral imperative. Donations were solicited with claims of miraculous intervention. Yet financial records suggested that the majority of funds were not directed toward charitable or ministry activities, but instead supported personal enrichment and media operations controlled by Lamb. Legal scrutiny intensified as complaints from former donors, whistleblowers, and regulatory authorities highlighted the discrepancies between the ministry's claims and its actual operations. Federal and state agencies examined accounting practices, CORPORATE filings, and the allocation of charitable contributions. Witnesses testified that Lamb had cultivated an environment in which devotion was leveraged to extract financial and social compliance, reinforcing both loyalty and control. The scandal surrounding Marcus Lamb's ministry raised broader questions about the intersection of faith, media, and financial exploitation. By presenting himself as a spiritual authority with direct access to divine favor, Lamb was able to influence behavior, extract wealth, and consolidate power over an expansive audience. Families reported long-term financial losses, strained relationships, and emotional trauma, highlighting the human cost of unchecked religious authority. Former employees described a workplace culture that rewarded obedience, punished dissent, and reinforced loyalty through spiritual rhetoric. Despite public scrutiny and investigative reporting, Lamb maintained a devoted following for years. Daystar continued to broadcast to millions, with supporters praising Lamb's teachings, interpreting media reports as attacks by secular critics, and reinforcing the narrative of divine legitimacy. The ministry's resilience underscores the enduring influence of charisma, media presence, and the promise of spiritual reward, even in the face of documented misconduct. The story of Marcus Lamb demonstrates the complexities of faith-based influence in the modern media landscape. It reveals how religious authority, when combined with broadcast reach, persuasive messaging, and promises of prosperity, can be leveraged for personal gain. Survivors of Lamb's ministry described the psychological, financial, and spiritual toll of devotion manipulated for profit, highlighting the need for oversight, accountability, and critical discernment among followers of religious broadcasting networks. Ultimately, the haunting question posed by Lamb's ministry is one that resonates beyond the walls of any single church or network. When faith is broadcast as currency and devotion is leveraged for wealth, who ultimately benefits: the believers who give everything in hope, or the pastor who profits from their trust? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.